We're doing a mid-range gaming PC build for AMD Ryzen today, specifically using the new AMD B550 motherboard. So that's the point of the build, is to try one of those out. Our content includes detailed testing and charts, including things like power consumption, some baseline thermals, gaming performance, a lot of overclocking and memory tuning efforts, and more. And more importantly, this is our first attempt at a new format for us of PC builds that we're referring to as PC build templates. Since we're basing our builds heavily off of data and testing, like from our reviews, we're playing with the idea of doing this templated rather than just providing a firm list of exactly what parts to buy. This, one, solves the availability and supply issues right now, and two, it gives you the expected freedom to modify the build and still have data that's useful to figure out how good it's going to be. So this provides a modular list with enough benchmarks that you can figure out which components to drop in. And for anything else, we'll point you to dedicated content throughout this video that might help further in things like overclocking, tuning, case selection, power supplies, all that kind of stuff. So let's get started. Before that, this video is brought to you by us and our brand new Gamers Nexus wireframe mouse mat. Aside from being the best way to directly support our long-form investigative reporting, you can also get a custom-made, high-quality mouse mat made with a high-detail 3D design that we created to show off heat sinks, coolers, video cards, and more. The mouse mat uses a stitched blue border for added longevity, a blue rubber underside for unique flare, and a microfiber cloth for smooth tracking. The mat is 36 inches by 12 inches and fits a keyboard and mouse easily. We sold out of the first run in 48 hours, but have more getting made right now. To backorder your mouse mat and ensure you get one in the next run, go to store.gamersnexus.net and backorder yours while reducing our reliance on advertisers, or click the link in the description below. So the objectives today, we are, as stated, doing a template, which means we're gonna give you a list of parts that we use for this build, but we've swapped stuff in and out, different GPUs, we've got CPU overclocking, memory tuning versus just straight XMP, depending on how adventurous you feel. We have different cooler selections, all kinds of stuff like that, so that it gives you a fuller picture as to what happens if part A or B is out of stock, or if you just decide you want something different than what we've chosen. The data's still there to support what you're trying to ultimately build. So for this one, we did use an ASUS B550 motherboard. It's a $150 motherboard. It's the cheapest one that we've received so far. So keeping in mind that we started this testing a little bit before embargo lifted, so it's not like we could buy them yet. We're working with parts that we received ahead of launch. And that means the cheapest one we had was the $150 ASUS Tough Gaming Plus B550 board. And that board, for a lot of reasons, was a pain in the ass to work with for overclocking, memory tuning, but, well, specifically memory tuning. The overclocking wasn't too bad, but the rest of it was all very straightforward. We don't have any major gripes, but we'll talk about it as we go through this and what the downsides are. There are obviously a lot of B550 boards out there. At this point, we haven't really worked with many of them, but this is the one we've worked with for this review. And that brings us to the other point of the way we do PC builds. For our PC builds, we don't just throw parts together randomly. We specifically test everything at some point or another. So these are things that have emerged from reviews or at least internal testing at one point, which to support the selection of the parts, we have data, is what we're getting at here. So there are a million ways or more to build a PC. You might have a different idea for what cooler, motherboard, whatever you want to use. Maybe something's on sale, whatever, go for it. There's plenty of ways to do it. This is the way we're doing it, and we chose these because we know they work together. So the parts chosen. We have the $150 motherboard, as stated. We've got some footage of that. That's new. We have a $60 case, but there are plenty of other options out there. It's $10 off now in the US at least, so it's about $50. But we do strongly recommend that you add a $7 to $10 120mm fan minimally, and you can see our Fantex P300A review for more information specifically on that point. So P300A, we've done a full individual review on. One of the nice things about the case, working with it, especially with this larger cooler, if you go with the Shadow Rock 3 as opposed to the stock air cooler, this thing, like most large coolers its size, is feisty. So I did get at least one cut while working with it when connecting the EPS cable. The upside is that the top panel of the P300A, very much to its credit, because this is uncommon, can be removed. And we have shots of that from our P300A review. And so it's pretty easy to get in there and access stuff, which we liked in the review. But you can check the review of the case for more information on stuff like that. Other parts, the 3300X is our go-to CPU for absolute budget, but highest performance possible gaming at the budget. The GPU we chose is the RTX 2060 KO. We can show some charts from the 2060 KO benchmarks we did, but that one was really interesting to us because NVIDIA accidentally forgot to turn some parts of the die off for the revision of the 2060, the new dies they released that were just 2080s repurposed with things fused off. They didn't fuse all of it off. And so it ends up being actually really advanced for things like Blender as opposed to where it should fall. And so we like that card for that reason. It's also a reasonable gaming card at the cost, and you're not going to bottleneck on the CPU. We've done a whole bottleneck benchmark, and you can go almost up to a 2080 Ti on the CPU. You shouldn't, but you could for the most part. Okay, rest of the parts. For memory, we used some T-Force RAM. It's just the blackout version. I think they call it Dark ZA or something. But we had it lying around, and it happens to be about $70. So it's some of the cheaper RAM that we have that's still good to reasonable at least. PSU, we recommend about a $50 to $60 power supply. We'll talk about the power spec in a bit. And then some hard drive, or SSD rather, would be the better choice. But you're spending something about maybe $70 for a baseline there, and then maybe a game storage drive. The cooler is optional. We chose this one. It's first thing on the shelf, but that's about 47 bucks. We've got thermal numbers for you. And the rest of this, as far as memory tuning goes, when you see the numbers for overclocking and tuning, we end up doing a 4.4 gigahertz all-core OC. On the 3300X, we already have a bunch of data on that from our reviews. And for this specific kit of memory, which is different from our review memory, we tuned it a bit. So we did all the primary timings. We tuned TFA, TRC, TCWL, obviously RAS, CAS, RDRD, TWTR, CKE, a couple others in there, and spent most of a day on this kit. This amount of work would have normally taken maybe 2 hours or so, 1 to 2 hours on a high-end board, but because of the limited troubleshooting capabilities, it took longer. Okay, let's get into it. The motherboard deserves early discussion. We decided to work with the cheapest of the AMD B550 boards that we've received thus far, just to see how it works at the low end. We're mixed on it overall. The ASUS Tough Gaming B550 Plus we used is supposed to be sold for about $150. And considering we're just powering a 4-core, 8-thread CPU with relatively low power requirements, it doesn't take much of a VRM or VRM heatsink to run it. That said, it does lose almost every single useful tuning feature aside from debug LEDs. And that makes memory tuning a nightmare. Without a retry and without any baked-in safe boot features, which would retain BIOS settings without applying them, most of the memory overclocking experience on this board is spent staring at a black screen and pulling the CMOS battery. That's the easiest way to get into BIOS after a failed set of memory timings. So it's a bit of a deterrent to actually going try-hard mode, because there's a good chance you'll end up pulling the CMOS battery anyway. That really slows things down for memory tuning. You can save and load profiles, but it's still nothing like working with a higher-end board for OC. It'd be way worse if you had already built the system, because then you'd be crawling around on the floor to pull the battery out between failed overclocks, and that might also include removing the GPU. There's no built-in button on this board that actually works for clearing CMOS, at least in our experience thus far, so pulling the battery was the best way. We'd recommend tuning it on an open bench before ever assembling the system. That way you can dial it in with the least amount of frustration possible on this particular motherboard. CPU overclocking is still straightforward, and it retains most of the mainstream features that you'd want from the higher end boards if you're not doing anything too crazy. It's not as debug friendly as something like a high-end X570 board, but if you're just doing something like a 4.3 or 4.4 gigahertz all-core overclock, that's really not any different on this platform than the others. There's still the usual mess of AMD's triple redundant settings all over the BIOS. Some of that is AMD's problem, some of it is on the board maker, but ultimately there's nothing really new here. If you're new to memory timings, tuning, and overclocking and want to get some of the benefits from it, the hours saved from going with a board that has safe boot would really justify the price in a lot of instances. For anyone less serious or not intending to tune memory, this is less of a concern. As for the rest, we'll put a chart on the screen for AMD's B550 versus X570 chipset differences. This comes from a separate video and article we ran on B550 versus X570 chipset differences. So if you're wondering what the actual result is from going to B550 and saving some money, this is what it looks like. The B550 chipset only changes a few things. First, you lose PCIe Gen 4 from the chipset, but you keep support from the CPU. That means boards that pull PCIe lanes from the CPU will still get Gen 4 speeds, so that includes the top slot on nearly every motherboard. You also get Gen 4 NVMe on most boards from the CPU, and that's really all there is to it. If you're worried about X570 versus B550 differences, aside from auxiliary features, the only real point of consideration is the PCIe generation support from the chipset. Check our chipset differences content for more discussion on this, and we'll link that below as well. For the CPU, we're using the AMD R3 3300X. We've done some tuning content on this in the past, if you're curious how that looks, but we'll flash through some of the charts of our recent i3 10100 CPU review to show you the newest of our game benchmark data that highlights the performance differences of the 3300X stock and overclocked, especially as compared to other similarly priced CPUs. Another item to glance at would be the 3100 in these charts. And note again that these charts, they're focused on CPU benchmarks and reviews. So that means this is trying to present a scenario where the CPU is constrained rather than the GPU. We'll look at a GPU-constrained, build-specific set of benchmarks after this. Even when we heavily tuned the AMD R3 3100 in a separate piece with all-core, Infinity Fabric, and memory tuning, we were unable to get it above the 3300X in almost all metrics, especially if applying simple all-core OC to the 3300X at the same time. This is because the 3300X uses a single CCX. We have some block diagrams for this that we can show to illustrate the differences. That means no splitting of the cache and no CCX to CCX latency to worry about on the 3300X, which uses a 4+0 configuration rather than 2+2. There's more of this in our 3300X tuning video and in the 3300X review if you're interested to learn more. Gaming performance, as you can see in these quick charts that we're flashing through from our reviews, is about as high as you'll get from AMD on the CPU side. It's not really worth upgrading from the R3 for only gaming to something like a 3600, but an R5 3600 would make a lot of sense as a budget choice for someone interested in the extra thread count. And there is value. If you do something like tile-based rendering and say Cycles Renderer with Blender, or you do maybe Cycles CPU plus CUDA or optics, then the 3600 would be well worth the investment. If none of that really sounds like something you do and you don't plan to work with any production applications, an R3 is definitely enough for gaming, at least today. The i5-10600K would be our next step-up recommendation for gaming, for which we've got plenty of benchmarks and tuning content on the channel, but then that's a completely different build. We ran some open-air thermals to establish a baseline of overclocking capabilities. With an all-core CPU workload using Blender cycles to render a scene tile by tile, we quickly found the stock 3300X cooler inadequate for anything that would involve heavier overclocking especially. Because we want to hold 4.4 GHz in all workloads, including Blender and gaming alike, we need to consider a cooler upgrade for our PC build. So this is the first optional add-on you'd do if you wanted to expand the budget, and it's one that we think is definitely worth it from an enthusiast standpoint. The stock cooler at max fan speeds ran at about 83 degrees for half of the render, eventually hitting steady state slowly and painfully at 90 degrees Celsius T-dive for the heavy all-core workload. Precision Boost 2 hurts the clocks at this point, although this is something of a real-world worst-case scenario for all-core. And by real-world, what we mean is this isn't Prime 95. This is an application you might actually use in real-world use. That said, games will run cooler, and games are often bound by the GPU or loaded heavily on it anyway, so thermals aren't as concerning there. You really want a case fan pointed near or at these downdraft coolers to help things out. Throwing a Be Quiet Shadow Rock 3 on there, which is about $47 US, it's just the first thing we pulled off the shelf, we were able to maintain in the range of 73 degrees Celsius with the stock result. Overclocking the 3300X to 4.4 GHz and holding a get voltage of 1.362 V core, we ran at about 77 to 79 degrees Celsius. The Shadow Rock 3, or similar tower coolers, of which there are plenty, mind you, would be a good choice for anyone interested in more advanced overclocking with this CPU. Remember that this board is trying to cheat the power numbers, whether intentionally or not, so that means more power budget available to the CPU. That doesn't mean it uses it though, and we'll look at that in a moment. Here's a recent CPU thermal chart from one of our case reviews. This uses our standardized case test bench, so it's a different build than our build today, clearly, but it provides a baseline from which you can determine a good case for your build, especially if you're doing something that's a tower cooler oriented configuration, because then the results in the hierarchy will be about the same as here. The P300A with 2 extra fans totaling about $70 would be one of the cheaper paths to acceptable cooling, while the P400A RGB or TD500 at about $90 to $100 would be the higher end solutions without the need to buy extra fans. We do think, if you look at our P300A review, this is probably one of the better budget courses to getting a cheap case right now, but it really does need at least one extra fan thrown into it. This next chart is zoomed in to look at frequency over time on the B550 build, tested with the stock cooler and with the Shadow Rock 3 in our open air configuration. Again, cases are going to be worse in general than open air, so use our case review charts to determine the right case for your build. This one provides us a pure baseline that is not really influenced by anything else. In this scenario, the 3300X with its stock cooler fell to about 4093 MHz all-core, which is entirely due to thermals and some power leakage. A lot of cases will really exacerbate that and make it a lot worse. The Shadow Rock 3 had a much more dynamic frequency that was less thermally constrained, posting an all-core average of about 4200 to 4210 MHz. That's a significant uplift and is thanks to how Precision Boost 2 works. As we've shown in the past, and we'll put our R9 thermal frequency chart up now from our LN2 experiments, every 5 degrees Celsius or so of change will net a frequency impact with Precision Boost 2, which is not the same as Precision Boost Overdrive. It may be worth considering the better cooler even if running stock. It's capable of lower temperatures at a quieter noise level, but also natively boosts performance without a manual OC, just due to PB2. As for power reporting deviation, the ASUS board underreports by a lot. We recently ran an in-depth research piece on Hardware Info's power reporting deviation metric, which is useful for determining how far off a motherboard is from baseline of 100% power reporting. The power reporting deviation metric is one that is useful only under 100% all-core workloads, but that's what this test is. So we can see that the ASUS board underreported from a baseline of 100% down to 83 to 87%. This means that the board is tricking the CPU, just like a shunt mod would on a GPU, into thinking it's drawing less power than it really is. This means that it's permitting a higher power budget than is natively intended. That doesn't mean the CPU is actually drawing that much power, but rather that it can. Ideally, this number should read 100%. Anything greater than a 5 to 7% deviation downward begins to get into questionable territory of resembling what functionally amounts to PBO pre-applied. Maybe ASUS will update this with a later BIOS version, as we saw with ASRock in our initial research piece, where the special review BIOS was cheating the terms of power limits a lot more than the later BIOSes. Moving on from the motherboard, we next need to determine how much power is necessary for this build. In our CPU reviews, we test at the EPS 12-volt cables to cleanly measure the pre-VRM efficiency loss power consumption numbers. We'll show two of those power consumption charts on the screen and highlight the 3300X stock and OC results. These are from our 10100 review, which is one of the most recent CPU reviews. And first note that the OC results will change based on the voltage configured. So it's not just magically that power consumption because it's that frequency. It depends on the voltage you set. Just like the stock numbers depend on the voltage that the motherboard auto applies if that's how you use it. Second, this number only gets us part of the equation. To determine the total power supply wattage that we need for a build, which is what this is today, we need to test the total system power consumption instead. Here's the total system power consumption numbers. Idle, with Windows in the Ryzen performance mode, we're at 47 watts stock and 66 overclocked. That includes a higher memory and SoC voltage for the OC, mind you, but overall, this is about what we'd expect for something where we've disabled at least some of the power saving options in Windows especially. Simple YouTube playback runs at 66 watts and 73 for total system power consumption when overclocked. The highest number we measured overall was the overclocked F1 4K result, marked at 260 watts. Red Dead 2's gaming result at 1080p medium, which is a pretty balanced workload of CPU and GPU here, measured at 244 watts overclocked. Blender, rendering the GN logo, measured 233 watts for GPU and CPU tile rendering simultaneously. Each power supply is different, but as a general rule of thumb, you want to be around 60% of the maximum continuous power capabilities of the power supply for maximum efficiency, but that's going to change a little bit unit to unit. That doesn't mean you couldn't run at 80% or 90% load of the PSU, but it's more efficient and generally better for the power supply to stay below those marks. To that end, we'd be comfortable pairing this build with a power supply anywhere from 450 watts to 600 watts. 400 watts, you start getting into territory where a lot of them are just lower quality, period, because it's not that expensive in terms of power supply cost these days to go up another 50 watts. But you could do it. It's just that the quality overall gets a lot lower. Depending on how much of an upgrade pathway you want on the same power supply in the future, 450 to 600 is good. If you're planning to use the system until it retires with no upgrades really in sight, 450 watts or 500 watts would be where we'd settle, depending on the pricing and the quality of the power supply at that price point, and then we'll make some recommendations on options in the description below for more help on that. Getting into the game benchmarks for this specific build then, we've already shown you some numbers from a CPU constrained scenario. So that'd be how we review CPUs like the 3300X in our original review, where we remove to the extent possible within reality the GPU limitation, and that's to determine the efficacy of the CPU, at least down to 1080p with maybe medium settings depending on the game. We don't really go lower than that because it's just too unrealistic. It's too much of an academic exercise at that point, which is fun, but not particularly useful. So for this, what we're doing is a more graphics bound load. This is the same benchmarking we do for our bottleneck testing, where we're testing what's the maximum reasonable GPU you can couple with the CPU. That's what we're deploying here. Same games, higher settings for the most part. And this is a as stated, graphics constrained, so it's under the assumption that you like to play your games maybe at, say, high settings or ultra or something like that, and you're less CPU bound. So for the most part, a CPU overclock won't really do that much, which is fine. It's just an important thing to show because CPU OC and memory tune doesn't always get you a lot. It just depends on how bound you are by other components. Now, a couple of things here. We are going to, in some of these charts, have data from our 3300X review and bottleneck testing. In those tests, we used an X570 master that has a 100.00 B clock that's very stable, works properly. This board seems stuck at about 99.8 most instances, and the net result is you have a bit lower frequency, which can impact the performance even when GPU bound to some extent. So you see that reflected a bit, where what seems like a like for like actually ends up being a little bit different by a couple percentage points. Another difference is that the memory's obviously changed, so it's much looser timings than the tighter timings we do reviews with. And then also for the stock results without the Shadow Rock cooler, so the OC tune results, that's with the Shadow Rock. Stock results are with the stock cooler for the 3300X. And those results, you're going to have a slightly lower, at least for the duration of these tests, clock because of T-die raising by a couple degrees, so in the very least. So that affects the results as well. And then for more, you can check the GPU bottleneck charts from the 3300X in a separate video we did previously. But let's go through the games for this build. In Red Dead Redemption 2, with higher settings and at 1080p, the R3 3300X and 2060 KO configuration that we built ran at 70 FPS average with the new B550 platform and the cheaper memory with looser timings. That's the main difference for this build as opposed to our formal bench numbers, which present 72.4 FPS average. The 70 FPS average allows the 10600K stock configuration and its 2060 KO a lead of 9.6%. It'd make more sense to pair the 10600K with a higher end GPU, seeing as it scales relatively cleanly all the way up to a 2080 Ti. The 3300X and 2060 KO with a CPU and memory tuned together gained another 2 FPS average. Pretty miserable, really. But since we're GPU bound more than anything, this makes sense. It'll only normalize with the other test bench platform results where we did our previous 3300X GPU bottleneck testing, and to get anything more than that, we would need to be CPU constrained. At 1440p, the 3300X and 2060 build ran at about 54 FPS average. You could hold 1440p with lower graphics settings if desired, but it'd be a bit rough. The overclock got us to 56 FPS average, which is only as minimal as it is, again, because of the GPU bind. Remember that if you want to see how it looks in a CPU constrained scenario, you'd need to check our CPU reviews for how the overclock would affect CPU constrained performance. An upgrade pathway might include something like a 5600 XT in this particular game. It doesn't always work out that way, which would bump us to 60 FPS average here. Or the 2070 Super, which is more universally an improvement, bumping to 72 FPS average. 4K with this game is brutal on all of the parts, including the 2080 Ti that we tested previously. Don't build this system expecting 4K gaming in most configurations. There are times it's doable, it obviously depends on the game, especially lighter games like F1, but this isn't one of those times. We'll show F1 2019 with higher settings as well, but mostly to illustrate that overclocking can still be beneficial even when running higher graphics settings. Our 3300X and 2060 KO build is now running at about 114 FPS average stock or 117 FPS average overclocked. We're falling behind the 3300X and 2060 KO on our test bench marked at 123 FPS average, which is again a result of the lower B clock on the board and other differences like the timings, the cooler on the stock model for stock to stock, things like that. Even though it's not running at 90 here like it was in Blender for the CPU T-die with that stock cooler, you'll still have some frequency loss for every few degrees higher than it is with something else. Performance is overall great for the price though, considering our other tests on this chart were all done with expensive motherboards. At 1440p and with the same settings, our build ran at 88 FPS average with the overclock and with the memory tune both applied. The RTX 2070 Super, as tested in our previous bottleneck testing, landed at 120 FPS average. That'd be a few points ahead given the motherboard difference that we've already discussed, but it's close enough for a reference point. So if you wanted to run this particular B550 board we're using today with the 2070 Super, you could expect it to be, with the same 3300X obviously, within a couple of percentage points of the previous result on the X570 board. They're close enough. It's a B clock difference for the most part. We'll stop with Shadow of the Tomb Raider. We know it's not as many games as we normally publish for these, but there's a reason for that. We've established a pattern, and the pattern says we're within a few points of the original 3300X bottleneck content where we tested a 2060 KO about a month ago with the 3300X and a bunch of other CPUs. So you can check that content for more of these gaming charts. It'll be about the same performance as this PC build, except this one's just a little bit lower. It's easy enough to extrapolate it. Most of the time it's not appreciable to a human anyway. In Tomb Raider at 1080p, the R3 2060 KO combo ran at 103 FPS average in our build with the B550 board for stock and 105 when overclocked. With no appreciable difference anywhere in sight, including the lows, it's not particularly worth the OC effort if you're going to be GPU bound basically all the time. The clearest upgrade would be something like a 2070 Super, or not shown with the 3300X here, maybe a 5700 XT. We're GPU bound, again, not CPU bound, and the motherboard is dealing with a light enough load from the CPU that the VRMs aren't even close to a concern, even if there are better boards out there. And there are, we just haven't gotten to them yet. It's good overall. The output you get is plenty on the 3300X for gaming scenarios. You don't need to worry about being GPU constrained if you're buying anything even remotely close to what should be paired with this. So once you start going over a 2080 Super, it's way too imbalanced, and you should probably buy even 2080 Super. You should definitely buy a different CPU. It starts to become too imbalanced. So 2070 Super and below, no problem pairing it with a 3300X, and otherwise check our other charts for more information on that. So if you were to look for something higher end, we'd recommend the 10600K and an overclock. Really fun CPU to work with, extremely easy to overclock comparatively, and great enthusiast starter CPU, strong baseline gaming performance. If you want something that's less gaming focused, more production, and maybe you want to drop it into a build like this, just a different CPU, the 3600 still gets a recommendation. You can check our best CPUs content for 2020 so far if you want to learn more about why we recommend different CPUs, we do. But the 3600 is, and I'm assuming here we're talking with a less frequent visiting audience to Gamers Nexus than maybe our core audience, because typically people who need help with builds don't watch every day. So recapping a lot of stuff this time. But 3600 gets you a couple extra threads, and that is beneficial in things like Blender and Premiere to some extent, and 7-zip compression, decompression, code compile. It isn't as useful really in gaming. So that'd be an option to upgrade if you're doing more of that type of workload. And then finally, you could save a lot of money with a lower end GPU and still be plenty happy for 1080p gaming. This one gets you to 1440p in a lot of instances. Obviously, it depends on the game. And even 4K sparingly. Like F1 4K, we didn't show the chart earlier, we can pop it up if we have it, but F1 4K is really not terrible. It's gonna depend on the game, obviously. So that's it for this one, thanks for watching. This was, as stated, a slightly more consumer-friendly approach to the content, but also adding in a lot of templated information for our enthusiast audience who want to see what happens when you drop different parts of the build and replace it with something else. So let us know what you think of the PC build template approach as opposed to just like, here's the build, that's what it is, because this is a little bit more fun for us based on our data-driven approach typically. So we enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus, and we'll see you all next time.